Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Omnex webinar on NetZero 𝐊𝐴42 and carbon neutrality standards, ISO 14068 webinar. We'll wait for a few minutes while we have more people sign in, and then I'll go ahead and introduce Mr. Chad Kymal, who will be presenting the webinar, and we'll go on from there. So give it a few minutes, and then I'll introduce Chad, and we'll get started, okay? Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started and let more people join on as they come in. So again, welcome to the Omnex webinar on NetZero 𝐊𝐴42 and carbon neutrality standards, ISO 14068 webinar. I would like to introduce you to Mr. Chad Kymal, who's the founder and CTO of Omnex. He's been at the forefront of the movement on carbon neutrality for a long time now, and he believes that organizations should now start to come in line with the ISO standards related to carbon neutrality as well. He's also an expert in the US on ISO 14068, climate change management, transition to net zero part 1 carbon neutrality, which was released last year. Again, it provides guidelines to organizations seeking to make claims for net zero and or carbon neutrality, and is gaining steam in the industry now as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Chad Kymal. And Chad, why don't you take it away and start the webinar?
Thank you, Andrew. Welcome, everyone. So you can see here, there are two standards. This 𝐊𝐴42 that came out with right before a very important Dubai meeting, where the different countries were negotiating. I participated with it's a ISO and UN, and this is really fast-tracked to come out with this standard before this meeting in the end of the year in Dubai, if you remember that meeting. And then ISO 14068 was more in a draft stage while 𝐊𝐴42 came out, okay? So time to time, we have people who repeat and come to our webinars, but we do have many new people. Maybe 1/3 of the audience might be new. For those, all of you new to us, just to tell you, we're a global organization with over 700 employees. We've actually been in business for 38 years, and I'm joining you from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is where we have the global headquarters. We participate in a lot of different standards writing, including myself. And these environmental standards are very important for the world and very important to me personally, is why I have participated in it. Here's a look at our global offices. We have very strong offices in key parts of the world. We are, we have consultants everywhere, and we have offices, in less places. A little bit about our target market, but of course, the subject of today cuts across industry, and it can be applied to anything from a service industry to a manufacturing industry. Does not matter if you're in aerospace, semiconductors, or medical devices, the standard is the same. It just, in fact, all the things you have to do are the very same also. So what do we do, and what can we do for yourselves? For those of you trying to work with, ISO 14068, or you want to become net zero, we do everything from a gap to training to implementation and coaching and so on, okay? Let me just say this. This is maybe more apt. That's why I didn't say the last bit there. So we have a registrar affiliated with us. It's actually set up to be independent and on its own. But they are part of the folks who are, sponsoring this webinar, Omnex S3. So we do functional safety, cybersecurity, and of course, sustainability standards. So this net zero is a part of these sustainability standards that we can audit and register. It's actually called a verification of a claim, okay? And we are going to be looking at ANAB accredited and unaccredited certifications is what we are trying to do. Folks, you can start asking questions. There's a Q&A button there. See if you have any questions you want to ask. Folks, I'm going to jump without, I don't think you need to know so much about who I am, other than my credibility with these two standards come from participating in writing it, okay? So this COP27 meeting, if you know, there's a COP28, which will be in 2023. So countries have met together for 27. Last year was 28, and then this year will be 29. So a number of years, people have been negotiating and to write these standards for, to help the world reduce the carbon footprint. All right, what we'll do is we'll start with what is carbon neutrality and net zero. Very importantly, you'll see a lot on management commitment and leadership's role. It's very important in all standards, but especially important if you're trying to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero, okay? You'll hear the word scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. What is that? What do you have to set your targets to? You have to set a scope 1 target, scope 2 target, and scope 3 target. And then we'll talk to you about an all-important carbon neutrality plan, and then a pathway to get you to carbon neutrality. So when you start, you won't have carbon neutrality. In fact, we would prefer, the standard won't let us have you start immediately offsetting. Okay, you can offset, but first you have to show reductions. So the carbon neutrality and net zero pathway, I'll show you a pathway in the standard itself, and you have to create this pathway for yourself. And then you can create a report and make a claim, which is when the verification body and validation body will come in and ensure your claim is solid, okay? And then very little on net zero and EMS. I just wanted to leave it there just to take a poll and see what you think. But I'm ahead of myself. Let us start at the very beginning on terms of what is carbon neutrality. My gosh, it's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. So it says, in a specified period of time, the carbon footprint. So you need a baseline, and from that baseline, you need to have reduced your emissions, and you could have removal enhancements, okay? And then whatever is left from that, you can then counterbalance it by offsetting, okay? So in one, it's your operations, how you're, what to get from your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and then you'll make an effort on doing removals. And then your removals may not be enough to get you carbon neutrality. Then you can try to counterbalance it by offsetting. And then they say, hey, there are specific roles for carbon credits. There is so much, there's concern in the writing team about how, in terms of, are people using the right carbon credits? Is the carbon market itself doing its job to make sure quality carbon credits are out there? So there is clause 11 in ISO 14068 spells out what kind of carbon credits you can take and count towards you. All right. All right. Let's move a little bit more, and then saying, what is carbon neutrality? State of being carbon neutral. Condition where the carbon footprint is reduced with emission reductions, and then with the removal enhancements, okay, which is you might plant trees, you may try to take carbon from the air and have sinks, and then you can of course counterbalance it by offsets. And when you have, if you're in the state of being carbon neutral, then what you can do is make a carbon neutrality claim. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, and trying to make you understand what this carbon neutrality in ISO 14068 and net zero in IWA 42, what it's all about. So first we have to say that you need to know how to do your carbon footprint. Your carbon footprint is always expressed in terms of a carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, that's why it's equalized in a carbon dioxide equivalent. And for a product, it's based on your life cycle of the product. So you can do a greenhouse gas, set your goals and do carbon neutrality for the organization, or you can do it for a product. But I'll tell you more about that. I have some slides just on that. All right, with that, let's talk about net zero. Net zero, I'll just read the definition, but I have a graph which will explain that much better. Condition in which human-caused residual emissions are balanced by human-led removals. No offsets. Do you see that? To become net zero, you have no offsets, but there's even more. You can see here, human-led removals, including ecosystem restoration, carbon capture and storage, reforestation, and so on, okay? And so this residual emissions are, once you start improving your organization, they say you cannot do any better after you reach a certain level. So in net zero, you should have reduced it further. That says, I'm a machining company, I'm a chemical company, and there's only so much you can do, because everything else you have done, that's called residual GHG emission. And withdrawal of a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, not accidentally, as a result of deliberate human activity, when those balance out, it's zero. I think it's actually not, I think I've explained it well enough, but I'll show you a graph shortly. Now, what standards do you have to know other than 14068 and 𝐊𝐴42? Well, there's a whole 14064 series, and then there's 14067, a carbon footprint for products. There's many, 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 many more. But really, you know, this would do, I think, as a start. All right, this is the definition of carbon neutrality or net zero, but I'll show that to you in a pathway, okay? So you can see here, GHG emissions, this is the ultimate, scientific residual level you can reach. And these are then the unabated GHG emissions you could remove. But your carbon footprint includes both, okay? Initially, this is your GHG emissions plus any removals you have done, which is actually negative. That is your carbon footprint. And if it's more than zero, then you have to do offsets. And once you do those offsets, it should be, net result should be zero. When it's zero, you have reached carbon neutrality. Of course, how do you get net zero? No unabated GHG emissions, only residual, only removals, and no offsets. So residuals minus removals is zero, then you're net zero. I know even for me, it took me a while to, nail these things down. I'm wondering if you've caught it. Maybe you'll have to get the tape of this webinar and listen to me a few times, okay? All right. Or some of you might be experts. And so here is the carbon neutrality pathway. This is when you started with your management's commitment. And this is your GHG emissions. This is the unabated to scientifically derived residual level. This is your plus. Now, this is your minus. Reduction. So reductions that you have done. This is removal credits, reduction credits, and then offsetting, okay? And all of this together, is going to give you your carbon neutrality, right? Okay. So they want to see that you've actually made some reductions here. And this, of course, is your offsets right here, okay? And what is net zero? So watch this carefully, all right? So in here, that's only unabated. So that's one part. I can say it's maybe here. One part of it, it says you only have residual GHG emissions, and you got to get rid of your credits. Once you get rid of your credits, maybe it's right there. Let's see, okay? All right, that is where your net zero is, okay? Only residuals and only removals. When this and this equals zero, then you are net zero, okay? I hope I have done a good enough job for you. What kind of questions do you have? Shall I pause here and have a sip of water? So see if you have any questions left in terms of what is net zero and what is carbon neutrality. Was that helpful enough? All right, we got a whole set of slides here left to view. Before I do that, I'd like to know a little bit about who you are. What is your knowledge of carbon neutrality and net zero? Is your organization moving towards carbon neutrality and net zero? And do this quick. We have it as 3 different questions, okay? And why are you doing it? Is it because of your customer, your top management? What else? Okay, go to the next one if you can, if you don't mind. Mike? Okay, so it looks like many of you are new. Okay, go to the next one. Next question. Do you have a second question? Do. Okay, all right. Okay, let's do this. No. So, wow, everyone just a no. Let's go to the next one. Many of you are not answering. That's okay. Go to the next one. Okay, continue on to the next one, please, Mike Miller. Oh, I need to close it. Sorry about that. Okay. Go to the next one. Can the audience see the answer, or only I can see the answer? Are you guys able to see the answer? Okay. Go ahead and close it, if you don't mind. Okay, customer. In fact, most of your customers have a carbon neutrality on net zero. And because they have it, you have to be reporting your carbon neutrality. I mean, you have to start reporting your carbon footprint. And if they have to improve scope 3, you're part of scope 3 for your customer. And I'll try to explain that to you. All right, let's go on here. So here are some principles I just wanted you to see, and I bolded what I thought some important things like transparency. You got to be transparent because you need to be honest. Conservative, not take liberties and because there's numbers, okay? Ambition, you need to have ambition. I'll especially talk about ambition when you set targets, when we talk about targets. You need to have a sense of urgency. You need to be accountable, okay? I look at the left-hand side more than the right-hand side, but you can see I highlighted some of the same things on both sides. What we'll do now is we will take a good look at top management commitment and leadership's role. In fact, you cannot get started unless you do this. So top management needs to document a commitment statement. Now, I wanted to ask you this question, but I did not want to put my webinar team under duress. I wanted to ask you, are you all familiar with EMS? But your commitment statement, you could even make it part of your EMS policy, right? What is your commitment to carbon reduction? Okay. Next, you need to have set a framework and a pathway. I'll just jump here. You need to define your scope. You need to set an organizational structure. Very important now, some dumb documents. You need to have, which I'll define for you, a carbon neutrality management plan. You just need to say, other than my commitment, which I have to document, and my scope and boundaries, and my org structure, I will need to have, okay, this is just ISO 14068, not from IWA 42. This means these are all shalls that you have to meet, okay? These are shalls you have to meet to get, certified to these standards. All right. So you need to come up with a carbon neutrality plan. And then, when you hit zero, carbon neutrality, you need to continue offsetting or reducing your offsetting and to continue reducing your unabated emissions. I hope you know what unabated emissions are. These unabated emissions are things you can take out till you reach your residual level, okay? All right. Leadership commitment from IWA 42. IWA 42 is a guidance standard 14068 is more of a, verification validation standard. So what it says is prioritize emissions reductions, not offsetting, prioritize reductions in your organization's scope and boundaries. Number one. And it encourages you to use alternatives to high greenhouse gas emitting processes, materials, practices. And of course, always there'll be a tussle. Somebody will say, hey, we're going to cost us more if you do this or whatever. And then you're going to have to figure out, how do you reduce your greenhouse gas? Prioritize, as you can see here, and you'll see this in IWA 42, they take you beyond just GHG into the environment itself, okay? Prioritize environmental integrity, protection, enhancement of nature. But if you do afforestation, definitely that has a greenhouse gas, reduction enhancement, okay? Or it's a removal that you can claim. All right, and then they encourage you to have high quality removals and storage. Not something, and that's where the checking will come in from the verification and validation. How well are you doing this? And then the validation is to ensure, backwards and forwards, things have happened as planned by the organization. And IWA 42 says, safeguard society, human settlements, and come up with ambitious targets. So some very interesting things here. So 50%, you have to do a 50% global GHG emission reduction by 2030 from a 2018. So taking a 2018 level, you should cut it in half by 2030. Why 2030? I'll explain that to you in the next slide, why that's important. They want you to have no scope 1. This is direct. This is from purchased, energy sources. 0 and scope 1, achieving a state of no scope 1 and no scope 2. And then scope 3, which is a supply chain, to bring it to less than 5%. Of course, when they say no, you'll have to get it to what is your residual level, because you cannot go beyond that. Working towards a state in which removals exceed emissions. And this is, they think it's very possible that you could have a negative footprint. What do you think about that? Where your removals exceed your amount of emissions. That's kind of ambitious, but it can be done. All right. So this is the guidance standard. And why 2030? 2030, there's a 50% chance that the ocean will warm up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if that happens, look at the statistics, folks. All right? Look at the statistics. What happens when that takes place? So what has the United States done? Under the Biden administration, the United States has announced targets to halve US greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and reach a net zero by 2050 as a country. And of course, 130 nations have joined in this intention on the climate change. And also 400 large, in fact, I did that a year ago, but just about everybody who's anybody has got a carbon neutrality or net zero, ambition. Go ahead and take a few seconds and do that Google yourself, okay? Google that yourself. Folks, I want to pause every now and then and give you a chance to reflect, write questions down, so we can have a discussion of what all this is about. Let me understand, many of you said you're new. So, I'd like to hear from one of the participants. Is there anybody in this participating who have, your company has taken a carbon neutrality or net zero target? We could just put that into the chat, in the Q&A. I can share that with everyone else, okay? All right. Move on. Is there a global effort to reach net zero? Yes, absolutely, okay? More than 70 countries, including the biggest polluters, China, United States, European Union, have set a net zero target covering 76% of global emissions. Which country is glaringly missing, folks? I don't believe India has set a net zero target, okay? And more than 3,000 businesses and financial institutions. I have several attendees who are joining us from India. Why don't you guys Google one of the larger organizations in India? Here's Tata that you may want to look at, who is well credited. I'm fairly sure Tata has a net zero or carbon neutrality plan. Okay. I'm told India has set a target. All right. We'll talk about that in 1 second. So this is where ambition comes in. So you can see here that we need to assess the level of ambition in the plan. Because if there aren't ambition, then it's one of the key parts we're looking for in the management commitment. So it says high ambition can be demonstrated by setting wide subject boundaries. They don't pick and choose a small area of the organization, right? And they exclude really the places that are giving the emissions, and they say they're net zero or carbon neutral. It's misleading. In fact, the verification body shouldn't allow it. Achieving carbon neutrality for a whole organization. All the products just in one product, because you can announce it for one product if you want to. And planning and acting to achieve deep and fast GHG emissions. Reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. Use wind energy. Use electric energy, okay? Batteries. By the way, well, I'll tell you my personal ambition. I'll talk to you about what we try to do here in my home, okay? But let's go on and see what they're talking about here for guidance. This is coming from IWA 40. Clearly define its boundaries, including scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, direct, indirect, and then supply chain. Set targets for the organization to achieve net zero in the shortest point of time, no later than 2050. 2050 is considered too late. The world would have gone to hell in a handbasket. Why did I say that right? Prioritizes the organization's GHG emission reductions and removals. All right? Come up with what you're going to do for emission reductions and removals. Actions. Everything depends on actions for emission reductions and for removals, okay? And then they go on to say, determine appropriate indicators, establish and develop supply chain relationships, share knowledge and experience on what you have accomplished with others, and so on. I'll stop here and just say, every one of you attending, if you're part of organizations in automotive, aerospace, medical devices, maybe less medical devices, because the people who that are targeting it are large organizations. I'm not saying medical device does not have large organizations. It would be like the Medtronics of the world and the Strykers of this world that probably have a carbon neutrality or net zero standard. All right. So definitions of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I'm sure if you're really into this, it's something you want to understand. Number one, you need to understand what is the entity. You have to pick the entity and the subject. Is it an organization or a product? And then organization, you'll have to set the organizational boundaries. If it's a product, you'll have to use a full life cycle. Or, by the way, it could be an event. Because, I mean, somebody might be doing exhibition, you say it right. Or it could be some kind of event that you try to show, I have done this event, major event involving hundreds of thousands of people or 1 million people, or let's say it's a concert that Taylor Swift is doing, but she says, I've done this concert with carbon neutrality and net zero in mind. All right. Scope 1, the direct emissions coming from the organization. Scope 2, indirect emissions from purchased energy. Scope 3, from the supply chain. So your total GHG is considered to be direct, indirect, and supply chain, okay? I have some examples for you so you can get an idea what to do. All right, now that we have established what the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 is, let's go take a look at this very important document called the Carbon Neutrality Plan. So what do you have to have from here? Start with a commitment from the top management. Identify in the org chart who are those people responsible. I'll just go through. Basically, you'll come up with the baseline and how long you're going to take to get to carbon neutrality and then net zero, and the targets and the activities you're going to do is what is in this plan. All right. Can you go to carbon neutrality? Put that in the plan. Can you move to net zero? Put that in the plan. Can you go to negative carbon footprint? Put that in your plan. All right. So I think it's going to be much easier now. I think the offsets will be much cheaper now. And it's going to become more and more expensive as more and more people go towards this. Part of this carbon neutrality plan or carbon neutrality plan, you'll need to come up with targets. This is what 14068 says, achieve a reduction of GHG emissions. By the way, you can set it as an absolute target. I'm going to go from 150 to 75, or you can say it is based on 1,000 products I'm shipping, so that because my growth is there, I could still be carbon neutral because I'm growing. All right. So the target, absolute target, it keeps it level, but this will change the target and give you a higher target with growth. Makes sense, right? Specify the period in relationship to the baseline when you're going to achieve carbon neutrality and reduce GHG emissions. That is, improve the way you operate, and then remove GHG from the environment in your boundary. Okay, and then what you can do, if you still have, which you will have, if it's a plus, minus it through offsets. One of the things they've asked us to do is not to give verification certifications if the subject, that's who is applying, has not done removals. They cannot just do offsets. So this is coming. You can just see here, this is the shalls. This is the guidance. Set targets consistent with 50% global GHG emissions. I actually sort of mentioned it earlier as part of leadership commitment. And then they say achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. Net zero targets, which should include emissions relevant to scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, You can set targets separately and take into account the entire boundary of your organization. And then they say, don't just look at carbon neutrality and net zero, take a look at your impact on the environment. So some examples of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So you can see a scope 1, emissions from physical or chemical processing, your manufacturing process, okay? Transportation, owned or controlled by the organization. Intentional or unintentional fugitive emissions. You can't say, well, it's really not coming from us, it's just coming by itself. We're doing X, Y, Z. No, that you have to count that. Any generation of electricity, heat, steam, blah, 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 okay? What is indirect? Reduce energy commission is from purchased energy, okay? And switch to the use of renewable or low carbon energy. So they want to have you count your indirect, GHG emissions and then reduce that. And then what do you have? You have indirect emissions, which are your purchased products and services. Any other energy not in scope in 1 and 2. I won't read all this. See this? Business travel, employees commuting. So you get some plus points if you let them work from home. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. Big tussle for all the organizations. More of us want people to come to work. Employees after COVID want to get a partial working from home. All right. All right. So this carbon neutrality plan, setting the targets, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Now I think you're all become really familiar with that, we hope. Now let's look at this pathway that we have to do. So now this is where we are, and we start reducing our emissions till we reach the scientific limit. We cannot reduce any further. It's called a residual GHG emission. Now we've started using credits, okay? Credits. And we stop because we don't need it anymore. And then when we reach that, we reach net zero. But you can become carbon neutral right here, okay? This is what 14068 is looking for. And IWA 42 is about this. But then, when we do the verification and validation body, we want to be able to give both, either of them, okay? Because we want to encourage organizations to reduce their emissions. You can see changes in consumption, substitution of high emission to low emission products, power usage, right? If you reduce the power usage, it will reduce your carbon footprint of your product life cycle. Prioritize removals versus, defined as withdrawals versus offset. Why, folks? Why would we want to prioritize removals versus offsets? Offsets are good. It'll create an offset market, and more people will do projects where they can offer it as an offset so you can buy it on the market, okay? So it'll help the world no matter what. But really, they want the organization to come up with heat sinks and remove it by themselves. And then unabated GHG emissions can be offset or even offset. So, of course, unabated means these are the things you can improve, but you haven't improved. All they're telling you is you can use offsets, to start becoming net carbon neutral, okay? All right. So this is the pathway. And then once we reach carbon neutrality, we can make a carbon neutral report. This report needs to be public. It talks about the subject, its boundary, the rationale that you used, information on your plan, including your targets, the period to which the report corresponds, your baseline, and any improvements you have made. Of course, you can start this carbon neutrality report before you become carbon neutral, but of course, it becomes much, much more important after you have reached carbon neutrality, and then you can make a claim. And here is what you have to do to make a claim. A carbon neutrality claim shall be made once all the requirements of ISO 1468 are met. So we will make sure as part, so we don't think of this like a management system audit, but there are some elements and shalls in it that the verification body will have to check, okay? The entity shall prepare and publish an executive summary, and then external summary shall refer readers to a full text of the report. A summary should link to the full report, and it should be consistent with the carbon neutrality report that you did earlier. This claim is publicly accessible also, summarizes the scope and the boundaries. It states the carbon neutrality pathway. What is the pathway in terms of that you follow? And your pathway can be very similar to the pathway that, has been followed. State the amount of GHG emissions, GHG removals, emission reductions, and so on. And state the amount of carbon footprint in CO2. Now, somebody wants me to give, well, I'll answer that Q&A when I get to that. Folks, so this is what is verified by a third party. What kind of questions come up to your mind here? Is carbon neutrality pretty straightforward? Is anybody in our webinar today? Can you just put it in your chat if your company is currently going through it? I won't mention any company name. Is on a carbon neutrality plan and has a pathway. Anybody at all? All right. It appears that nobody is. I'm going to give you some time. I'm meanwhile going to Google different large organizations. I know General Motors already has one, GM, carbon neutral. All right. So GM set targets to become carbon neutral in its global products and operation by 2040. GM, that is a little too late, actually. Okay. The company is working towards a transition to 100% zero tailpipe emissions. Instead of GM, let me put down Tata. Maybe I'll put down Tata Motors. Yep. They say our aim is to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions for our passenger and commercial vehicles by 2040 and 2045. All right. Now let me, I don't know what the Tata, the IT part of Tata is. Tata, well, somebody else will have to do that. And this. Oh, I somehow put the right thing in. They also have one. Okay, let's go into, let's see who shall we check next? Let's check NVIDIA, also our customer, NVIDIA. Oh, I spelled that wrong. NVIDIA. Expect to achieve and maintain, okay. So they have a carbon sustainability. AI technology to enable net zero NVIDIA on demand. The worldwide goal is to reach net zero. So that's what NVIDIA says. You all know NVIDIA, the darling of Wall Street, the very big deal for the automotive industry, for electric vehicles and then autonomous vehicles. Okay. We actually helped them in I don't know how long ago now, go from company that did video games to automotive. They got our help, and we still work with them on that. All right. Folks, I'm not seeing enough questions here. I see a few, but see if you have any more questions you want to ask. All right. Let me just say, I'm on the ISO 14001. I'm on TC207. So we oversee both an EMS, and I specifically have participated in the carbon neutrality ISO 14068. I made sure both standards, call both other standards out. Of course, 14068 has nobody. I would say 95% of the people don't know 14,001. 14,001 people don't know 14068. Very reluctant to connect each other up. So one of the things I would like to ask is integrating with the EMS a good idea? To have this EMS programs whose job is carbon, pollution reduction and a commitment of leadership, which we're used to, integrating it back into it. What the problem is, it's two different sets of people top management has put into it. What do you think? Is it a good idea integrating it or not a good idea integrating it? What do you all think? Can you put that question up, Mike Miller? Yes or no? What do you think? Okay. All right. Let's close it, sir. Yes, most of you, my only worry and concern is that most of you are sort of automotive, not automotive, Omnex customers, and maybe you already gravitate to EMS. But part of it is maybe we need to educate our top management so they don't separately give the assignment to two separate groups, which then makes it difficult. But, few of you did say no. So, and I understand. In fact, it would be interesting for those of you who said no to maybe say why you said it's no. Okay. All right. So we are going to finish up here. So just to tell you, Omnex S3 that does verification and validation to NetZero. And we also do functional safety, ASPICE, and cybersecurity and SOTF. Those are product certifications, okay, called product certifications. Also through ANAB, which is the ANSI, American National Standards Institute. So I'm going to now go on to, this is some of the training. If you don't see here IWA 42-14068 training, we will do that just for you. If we don't think there's enough demand here in the yet. Okay. This attendee is asking about some examples. Folks, the carbon neutrality plan needs to be I think the plan needs to be public also, but definitely the report is public and the claim is public. Go Google. I could do that right now in front of all of you to give you some examples, but that's what you have to do. You can look at it from, look at what your competitors have done, and then it'll give you an idea what the scientific limits are. Maybe in your industry, they have published what is called a carbon, the pathway, they call it a pathway, the IPCC, okay? And all right, so I mentioned this earlier, India set a target for 2070. Oh, okay. Could you clarify the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero? All right. Without my slides, it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to exactly say it correctly, But in the end of the day, folks, no unabated emissions, which means you only have residual and then you have removals, no offsets. When the residuals meets the removals, boom, you're net zero, okay? In the pathway where you have unabated emissions and you have offsets, you could be carbon neutral if that equals zero, okay? So you use enough offsets to become zero. Of course, that will be expensive, but not that expensive. If you think it's important, you can do it like that, okay? Do you have to, does leadership have to be involved? Could it be at a, let's say, a vice presidential level? The answer is, they're actually looking for top management commitment coming from the very top of the organization. Okay. With that, I will say thank you all very much for attending. I hope you got a lot out of this. I plan to do more of these, as I hope the environment for carbon neutrality and net zero becomes, it should be right now. This world needs this to happen. Oh, I did mention to you, so here is what I have done I'm just actually doing this webinar, looking at my orchard. I've got 950 apple trees that I take care of, which is going to be then, it's part of the reduction, okay? And then what I did last year is I changed my furnace to a different type of furnace. Gosh darn it, so I changed the furnace. I can't think, much more efficient. That is part of the going to my unabated emission. What did we do? We changed all our windows so that it becomes much more efficient. So, I have not done an official carbon footprint check, but I mean, look at this. If you have a dog, they say, I forget which kind of dog they said, it could be as much as a large car, okay? So you have to be really careful how we measure it. I'm almost already, I'm not fully vegetarian, but pretty much there. And so you can see all these lifestyle choices and everything else could go into this carbon neutrality plan. Folks, thank you very much for your time. Hope you learned a lot from this webinar. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.
All right, everyone, for those who are left, it looks like there's some kind of hiccup and some people got split off from the main webinar and Chad continued with the rest of the attendees. So I apologize for that, but I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting now. Thank you for attending and have a great day.